Imagine your husband serving you divorce papers on graduation day, in front of everyone, cameras rolling, his mother smiling in the back row like she'd just won the lottery. His new woman standing beside him wearing blue like she came to celebrate Leora's downfall. This was supposed to be Leora's proudest moment. 4 years of late nights, sacrificed weekends, and fighting for every single credit hour while her own family worked overtime to make sure she failed. And now, in the courtyard of the university she'd bled for, her husband was handing her divorce papers like a farewell gift. The crowd watched her hands shake as she held those papers. They saw the humiliation. They saw a woman being publicly dismantled. But here's what they didn't see. They didn't see her phone buzzing in her pocket. 10 missed calls, 3 urgent messages. They didn't see the name flashing on her screen or the subject line that read, "Time-sensitive board decision final." While her husband and his mother were orchestrating her destruction, something else was happening, something they had no idea about. What happened in the next 8 minutes didn't just humiliate them back, it ended them. Completely. And it all started when her name echoed through the speakers in that auditorium, followed by a title they never knew she had. But before we show you what happened, I need you to do something right now. Drop a comment that says, "She deserves to win," if you believe women like her should have their voices heard. Because what you're about to see is what happens when you try to break someone who's already learned how to build themselves back up. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the person you underestimated was 10 steps ahead the entire time, and you were too busy celebrating to notice the ground shifting beneath your feet. The mansion loomed before Leora like a monument to everything she would never be allowed to become. It wasn't her first time crossing the threshold of the Harland estate, but that evening felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an unspoken verdict that had already been reached in rooms she'd never been invited into. She had married Riven 6 months earlier, in a ceremony that his mother Delira had orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Every detail controlled, every guest vetted, every moment designed to communicate one singular message. Leora was joining their world, not them joining hers. And now, as she stepped through those massive oak doors with Riven's hand barely touching the small of her back, she understood with sudden, crushing clarity that she had been summoned for judgment. The dining room was a masterpiece of old money intimidation. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across a table long enough to seat 20, though only 5 places had been set. Delira sat at the head like a queen presiding over her court, her posture so perfect it seemed engineered. Riven's father, Marcus, occupied the opposite end, a man who had perfected the art of communicating disapproval through silence. Riven's sister, Callista, was already seated, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. The 2 empty chairs sat side by side in the middle, isolated, exposed. Leora felt the setup immediately. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a tribunal disguised as hospitality. They had barely finished the first course when Delira set down her wineglass with deliberate precision, the kind of movement that demanded attention without asking for it. "Leora, darling," she began, her voice dripping with the false warmth of a predator who enjoys playing with her food. "Riven tells me you've been spending quite a lot of time at the university lately. Something about completing your degree?" The question hung in the air like a noose. Leora glanced at Riven, searching for support, for solidarity, for any indication that he would defend her choice to finish the education she'd postponed when they married. But his eyes were fixed on his plate, his jaw tight, his silence louder than any protest could have been. "Yes," Leora replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have 2 semesters left. I've been working toward my degree in international development for years, and I'm not going to abandon it now." She tried to smile, tried to make it sound reasonable, tried to bridge the chasm she could feel opening beneath her feet. But Delira's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened, crystallizing into something cold and immovable. "I see," Delira said, each syllable measured and deliberate. "And tell me, dear, who exactly suggested that a wife's ambitions should compete with her duties to her family? Because I'm quite certain that's not how successful marriages function in our circles." The words landed like stones, Callista's fork paused mid-air, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Marcus still said nothing, but his silence felt like agreement. And Riven, the man who had promised to love and support her, who had whispered dreams of partnership and equality in the darkness of their bedroom, sat frozen, complicit in his own cowardice. Leora felt something crack inside her chest, some fragile hope she'd been nursing, that this family might accept her, that she might find a place here, that love might be enough to overcome the vast gulf between her world and theirs. "My education isn't competing with anything," she said quietly, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "It's part of who I am. Riven knew that when we got married. He supported it." She looked at him again, pleading silently for him to speak, to remember the conversations they'd had, the promises he'd made. But it was Delilah who responded, leaning forward with the focused intensity of a surgeon making an incision. "A wife's place is beside her husband, not in a classroom competing with men." The words crashed into the room like a gavel striking wood, final and absolute. Riven has responsibilities, a legacy to uphold, a company to eventually lead. He needs a partner who understands what that means, not a student playing at independence. The contempt in her voice was no longer disguised. It was naked, sharp, designed to wound. Leora's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to scream, to overturn the table, to demand how they could be so blind, so cruel, so determined to shrink her down into something manageable and ornamental. But she also understood in that moment exactly what she was up against. This wasn't about education or ambition or even tradition. This was about control. Delilah had built an empire of influence through her sons, through strategic marriages and carefully cultivated relationships, and Leora represented a threat to that order. An educated, independent woman couldn't be controlled the same way, couldn't be molded, couldn't be trusted to stay in her place. The rest of the dinner passed in a fog of polite hostility. Dishes came and went. Conversation continued around her like she was a ghost at her own execution. And when they finally left, when Riven drove them home in suffocating silence, Leora stared out the window and realized that she had just witnessed the blueprint for her own erasure. They weren't going to support her education. They were going to systematically dismantle it, piece by piece, until she gave up or broke down. The only question was whether she would let them. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately known you weren't wanted? What Leora didn't know, couldn't know, was that the dinner had been a declaration of war, and Delilah Harland had never fought a war she didn't win. Within 48 hours, the campaign began. It started small, with gestures so subtle they could be mistaken for accidents, oversights, the kind of innocent mistakes that happen in busy households. But Delilah was a master of plausible deniability, and every move she made was calculated with surgical precision. The first casualty was Leora's scholarship notification. She had applied for a competitive grant that would cover her remaining tuition and provide a stipend for research. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon, sent to the family account that Riven had insisted she use because, as he'd explained with that charming smile she'd once found irresistible, it was easier to manage household correspondence in one place. Leora had agreed, not yet understanding that easier for whom was the operative question. Delilah had access to that account, full, unrestricted, unmonitored access. The email appeared in the inbox at 2:47 p.m. By 2:49 p.m. it was in the trash. By 2:51 p.m. it was permanently deleted. Leora never saw it, never knew that she'd been selected, never knew that a committee of professors had chosen her proposal out of hundreds, impressed by her innovative approach to sustainable development in underserved communities. Never knew that the deadline to accept was 7 days, after which the funding would go to the alternate candidate. When those 7 days passed in silence, the scholarship office assumed she wasn't interested. They moved on, and Leora, still checking her email obsessively, still hoping, never understood why she'd been overlooked. But the scholarship was just the opening move. Delilah's real genius lay in her ability to weaponize the people around her, turning them into instruments of sabotage without them even realizing they'd been conscripted. She began with Riven, inviting him to private lunches at his favorite restaurants, the ones with quiet tables in the back where important men discussed important matters. She'd order his preferred wine, ask about his work with genuine interest, and then, just as he was relaxing into the warmth of his mother's approval, she'd drop her concerns like poison into honey. "I'm worried about Leora," she'd say, her voice heavy with manufactured concern. "She seems so stressed lately, so distracted. I wonder if this academic pursuit is really good for her mental health, for your marriage." She'd pause, let the words settle, then continue with devastating precision. "I saw her the other day and she looked exhausted, thin, not herself. Don't you think it might be kinder to encourage her to focus on her well-being, on building a stable foundation for your future together? Children, perhaps, when you're both ready." Riven, who loved his mother and had been trained from birth to trust her judgment, absorbed these concerns like gospel. He started watching Leora differently, seeing exhaustion where there was determination, seeing obsession where there was dedication. He began making comments, small at first. "Maybe you should take a break this semester. Do you really need to stay up so late studying? My mother mentioned you looked tired." Each comment was a small erosion, a tiny chip in Leora's foundation. Meanwhile, Delira was executing the more technical aspects of her campaign with ruthless efficiency. The tuition bill that should have arrived in early September was intercepted before Leora ever saw it. Delira had connections at the university, donors whose contributions bought them certain courtesies, and she used those connections without hesitation. The bill was rerouted, delayed, lost in processing. By the time the university's automated system flagged Leora's account for non-payment, she was already behind, already scrambling, already looking like someone who couldn't manage her own affairs. Phone calls from her academic advisor went straight to voicemail, but not her voicemail. Delira had convinced Riven that a family phone plan would be more economical, more efficient. What she didn't mention was that it gave her access to call logs, message notifications, the ability to see exactly who was trying to reach Leora and when. Important calls were noted and then mysteriously never mentioned. "Oh, did Professor Martinez try to reach you? I must have forgotten to tell you, dear. You know how busy things get." Leora felt like she was losing her mind. Opportunities she'd been promised evaporated without explanation. Meetings she'd scheduled were somehow never on anyone's calendar. Her carefully constructed academic plan began to crumble, not because she was failing, but because the infrastructure supporting her was being systematically dismantled by invisible hands. She'd stay up until 3 in the morning, trying to make sense of it, sending frantic emails, making desperate phone calls, convinced that she was somehow failing at the most basic aspects of adult organization. And through it all, Delira maintained her mask of concerned affection. "You seem overwhelmed, darling. Perhaps this academic path is just too much right now. There's no shame in prioritizing your marriage, your family. Education will always be there, but these precious years with Riven won't come again." The words were delivered with such apparent kindness, such maternal wisdom, that even Leora sometimes wondered if she was right. Maybe she was pushing too hard. Maybe she was being selfish. Maybe a good wife would make different choices. But late at night, when doubt gave way to clarity, Leora knew the truth. This wasn't about her well-being or her marriage. This was about control, about ensuring that she remained dependent, manageable, small enough to fit into the box they'd prepared for her. And the most devastating part wasn't the sabotage itself. It was the loneliness. She was married to a man who was supposed to be her partner, her advocate, her safe place in the storm. But Riven had chosen his mother's whispers over his wife's reality. He'd become a weapon pointed at her heart, and he didn't even know he was holding the trigger. "Do you know what it feels like to be married and completely alone?" Celis Renworth appeared in Leora's life the way all great threats do, disguised as something harmless. She was introduced at a charity gala in late October as the daughter of one of Marcus Harlan's oldest business associates, a bright young woman who'd recently returned from studying abroad in Paris. She was beautiful in that effortless way that suggested generations of good breeding and expensive maintenance. She was charming in that practiced way, that made everyone feel like they were the most fascinating person in the room, and she was strategic in that calculating way that Delira recognized immediately because she'd been exactly the same at that age. Within 2 weeks, Sellies had become a fixture at Harland family dinners. At first, the invitations seemed innocent enough. The Renworths are such old friends, and Sellies is new to the city. It would be rude not to include her. But Leora noticed things that made her stomach twist with recognition. The way Delira seated Sellies next to Riven at every gathering. The way conversation would flow toward topics that Sellies could dominate. Her experiences in Paris, her thoughts on art and culture, her opinions on business strategy delivered with just enough deference to seem intelligent, without being threatening. The way Riven's attention would drift toward her when she spoke, his expression shifting into something Leora hadn't seen in months. Interest. What made it worse was that Sellies was good at the performance. She'd touch Riven's arm when making a point, laugh at his jokes with genuine-seeming delight, ask his opinion on matters she clearly already had thoughts about. She'd compliment Leora with words designed to diminish. "You're so brave to pursue education at your age. I admire women who don't worry about traditional timelines." She'd offer to help with things Leora didn't need help with, positioning herself as the capable one, the woman who had time and energy and grace because she wasn't exhausting herself with selfish academic ambitions. And Delira, the conductor of this cruel orchestra, made sure every note hit its mark. She'd invite Sellies to family events that Leora couldn't attend because of classes or study groups. She'd mention, casually, how lovely it was to have someone at the table who could really engage with the family's business interests, someone who understood their world. She'd take photos of these gatherings and send them to the family group chat, images of Riven and Sellies laughing together, of Sellies sitting in what had once been Leora's chair, of the family looking complete and content without her. Leora would see these photos while sitting in the university library at 10 p.m., surrounded by textbooks and research papers, and feel something inside her chest crack a little wider. She'd come home to find Riven scrolling through his phone, smiling at messages she wasn't included in. She'd ask about his day, and he'd mention, almost absently, that Sellies had stopped by the office to drop off some documents for his father, how they'd grabbed coffee, how she'd made an interesting point about market trends in Southeast Asia. The replacement wasn't happening in secret. It was happening in plain sight, with such calculated transparency that Leora felt insane for objecting to it. What was she supposed to say? That she didn't want her husband having coffee with family friends? That she was threatened by a woman who was just being kind and social? That she could see the scaffolding being built for her own obsolescence? She tried once to talk to Riven about it. They were in their bedroom, late at night, and she'd finally worked up the courage to voice her fears. "Don't you think it's strange how often Sellies is around? How your mother keeps inviting her to everything?" Riven had looked at her with such genuine confusion that it hurt worse than anger would have. "She's a family friend, Leora. What's strange about that?" And then, with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from not even recognizing you're being cruel, "Maybe if you were around more, you wouldn't feel so left out." The words hung between them like a verdict. This was her fault. Her absence, her choices, her selfish pursuit of education that made her unavailable for the real work of being a Harland wife. The parallel existence became more defined as winter approached. There were 2 versions of Riven's life now, and Leora could see them both with painful clarity. In one version, he came home to a wife buried in books, stressed about deadlines, unavailable for the social performances his family demanded. In the other version, carefully curated and displayed at every family gathering, he sat beside Sellies, a woman who had time for long dinners and gallery openings, and the kind of effortless sophistication that Leora, with her student loans and her earnest dedication to actually changing the world, would never possess. Delira made sure Leora understood the contrast. Sellies mentioned she might help with the foundation gala this spring. Such a relief to have someone who understands event planning at this level. "I know you're so busy with your studies." The message was clear. Here is what you're failing to be, and here is the woman who could be it effortlessly. Here is your replacement being groomed and positioned and prepared for the moment when you're finally, completely dispensable. And the worst part, The part that kept Leora awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Riven slept peacefully beside her, was that she could see exactly where this was going and felt powerless to stop it. Every hour she spent studying was an hour Celise spent ingratiating herself with the family. Every class she attended was a family dinner she missed, another opportunity for them to imagine what life could be like with someone more suitable in her place. She was being erased in real time, watching her own replacement being installed like new furniture, and the only way to fight it would be to give up everything she'd worked for, to surrender her dreams and become the decorative wife they wanted. What do you do when you see your replacement being groomed right in front of you? The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, delivered in Delira's precise handwriting on cream-colored stationery that probably cost more than Leora's monthly grocery budget. A family dinner to reconnect and find common ground. Let's move forward together in love and understanding. The words were so obviously a trap that Leora almost laughed. But Riven had found the invitation first, and when she came downstairs, he was holding it with something like hope in his eyes. Maybe this is a chance, he'd said quietly. Maybe if you just talked to her, explained your goals, she'd understand. The naivety of it broke her heart. After everything, after months of systematic sabotage and calculated cruelty, he still believed his mother capable of good faith. Or maybe he just wanted to believe it because the alternative was too devastating to accept, that his mother was deliberately destroying his marriage, and he'd been helping her do it. Leora agreed to the dinner because she was tired of fighting, and because some small, desperate part of her still hoped that maybe, just maybe, she could make them see her as something other than an obstacle to be removed. She wore her best dress, the navy one that Riven had once said made her eyes look like evening sky. She arrived exactly on time. She smiled at the right moments. She was perfect, composed, everything a Harland wife should be. And it didn't matter at all because she'd walked into an execution disguised as reconciliation. They were all there, Delira at the head of the table, Marcus silent and stern, Callista watching with predatory interest, and Celis, whose presence alone should have told Leora everything she needed to know. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a demonstration, a public forum designed to humiliate and break her. The meal began with false civility, polite questions about her studies, her plans, her health. Delira was particularly solicitous, asking after her classes with such apparent interest that Leora almost believed it was genuine. Almost. Then, halfway through the main course, Delira set down her fork with that familiar, deliberate precision, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Leora, darling, we need to have an honest conversation about your future, about Riven's future. The royal we, the assumption that she spoke for everyone at the table, for the family itself. We've been patient. We've tried to be supportive. But this academic obsession of yours has gone on long enough. It's affecting Riven. It's affecting this family. And we think it's time you made a choice. The word choice hung in the air like a blade. Leora's hands tightened around her napkin under the table. What kind of choice? She asked, though she already knew. Your education or your marriage, Callista interjected, clearly relishing the moment. Because you can't have both. Not in this family. We need to know that you're committed to being the kind of wife Riven needs. The kind of woman who can stand beside him as he builds his legacy. Not someone who's more interested in classroom theory than real-world responsibility. Leora looked at Riven, waiting for him to object, to defend her, to remember every conversation they'd had about partnership and mutual support. But he was staring at his plate, his jaw tight, his silence more damning than any accusation. He'd known. He'd known this was coming, and he hadn't warned her. He'd let her walk into this ambush with hope in her heart and trust in her eyes. And just to be clear, Delira continued, her voice smooth as silk over steel, this isn't a negotiation. We've already made arrangements for you to withdraw from your program. The paperwork is prepared. We've even found a charity position for you, something appropriate for a woman of your station. Volunteering with the Arts Foundation, nothing too demanding. You'll have time to focus on what really matters. Being a proper wife, preparing to be a mother, supporting Riven's ascent in the company. The audacity of it. The sheer presumption that they could dictate the terms of her life like she was property to be managed. finally broke through Leora's composure. "You've prepared withdrawal paperwork for my education? Without my consent? Without even asking me?" Her voice was rising and she didn't care. "Do you hear how insane that sounds? I'm not a child. I'm not your employee. You don't get to make these decisions for me." "Actually," Marcus spoke for the first time that evening, his voice carrying the weight of patriarchal authority honed over decades, "as Riven's wife, your decisions reflect on this family, and we have a right to protect our interests. You're destabilizing our son with this selfish pursuit. It ends now." Leora stood up so fast, her chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream. "No," she said, and the word felt like the first honest thing she'd said in months. "No, I won't do this. I won't let you erase me. I'm finishing my degree. I'm building my career. And if you can't accept that, if Riven can't accept that, then maybe this marriage was a mistake from the beginning." The silence that followed was absolute. Delira's face went cold, her mask of maternal concern finally dropping to reveal the steel beneath. Riven looked up at her with something like panic in his eyes, finally realizing that he was losing her and not knowing how to stop it. Cherise sat perfectly still, her expression carefully neutral, but Leora could see the calculation behind her eyes. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for, the final fracture that would give her an opening. "Sit down, Leora," Delira said quietly, each word precise as a scalpel. "You're making a scene." "Good," Leora replied, her voice shaking but determined. "Maybe it's time someone made a scene. Maybe it's time you all understood that I'm not going anywhere. Not because you command it, not because it's convenient for your plans. I'm finishing what I started, with or without your blessing." She turned to leave, to walk out with whatever dignity she had left. But Delira's voice stopped her. "If you walk out that door, Leora, there will be consequences. We've been kind so far, patient. But our patience has limits." Leora looked back at her mother-in-law and saw the truth written in every line of that perfectly composed face. This had never been about reconciliation. It had been about establishing dominance, about making her understand her place. And if she wouldn't accept that place willingly, they would force her into it. "Do what you have to do," Leora said quietly. "So will I." She walked out of that dining room and didn't look back. Behind her she could hear the eruption of voices, Riven calling her name, Delira's clipped commands. But she kept walking, through the mansion's grand hallway, past the portraits of Harland ancestors who'd built their empire on the backs of people they considered beneath them, out into the cold November air that felt like the first clean breath she'd taken in months. What she didn't see, couldn't see, was Delira pulling out her phone at the table, her expression hardening into something merciless and final. What she didn't hear was the whispered instruction, "Call her, tell her it's done." The her in question being someone who would put the final plan in motion, someone who would ensure that Leora's defiance tonight would become the catalyst for her ultimate humiliation. And that's when they made their fatal mistake. Because they were so focused on breaking Leora, on forcing her back into the box they'd prepared for her, that they never stopped to ask what she'd been building while they'd been tearing her down. They never wondered where she was going all those late nights at the university. They never questioned who she was talking to, what projects she was developing, what doors her intelligence and dedication were opening. They were so convinced of her powerlessness that they never considered she might be gathering power of her own. The trap had been set, the pieces were in motion, and in just a few weeks, on graduation day, they would all discover exactly what happens when you underestimate the woman you're trying to destroy. Here's what they didn't know. While Delira was scheduling that ambush dinner and carefully selecting the most humiliating moment to destroy Leora's spirit, while Riven was rehearsing his cold dismissals and Celis was choosing the perfect white dress for her victory parade, Leora was sitting in a different kind of meeting, the kind that doesn't happen in mansion dining rooms, the kind that changes the world. Let me take you back 3 months before graduation day. While the Harland family saw a struggling student barely keeping up with coursework, what they actually had under their roof was something far more dangerous. A woman who had spent 2 years not just earning a degree, but building an entirely separate empire they knew nothing about. You see, Leora's professors didn't just see her as a good student. They saw her as a once-in-a-generation mind. the kind of strategic thinker who could look at global problems and see solutions that hadn't been invented yet. Her thesis wasn't just academic theory. It was a fully developed framework for integrating sustainable healthcare systems across developing nations using adaptive technology and localized resource management. Sounds complicated, right? Here's what it actually meant. Leora had figured out how to bring world-class medical care to the poorest communities on Earth, not by throwing money at the problem, but by completely reimagining how healthcare systems could function. She'd created something revolutionary, and the people who mattered in global health were paying attention. Dr. Amara Chen wasn't just any professor. She was a former advisor to the World Health Organization, a woman with direct lines to the kind of power that makes governments nervous and corporations pay attention. And she had been watching Leora for 18 months. Every paper, every presentation, every late-night discussion that went 3 hours past office hours because Leora's ideas were too important to cut short. Dr. Chen saw what the Harlans were too blind to notice. She saw a mind that could reshape entire industries. So while Delilah was intercepting scholarship emails and hiding tuition bills, Dr. Chen was making phone calls. To Geneva, to the Global Health Consortium, to investment groups that specialized in the kind of world-changing initiatives that get written about in history books. She was building a case, and Leora was the centerpiece. The framework Leora had developed wasn't just impressive academically. It was immediately actionable, scalable, fundable. The kind of proposal that makes billionaires write checks and governments open doors. By the time that ambush dinner happened, Leora had already been through 4 rounds of presentations with the consortium. They'd flown her to preliminary meetings. They'd stress-tested her models. They'd brought in experts from 15 countries to tear apart her thesis, looking for weaknesses, and every single time, Leora had answers they hadn't thought of. Solutions to problems they didn't know existed. She wasn't just defending a graduate project. She was negotiating the terms of an $800 million global healthcare initiative. $800 million. Let that number sit with you for a moment. While Riven was calculating how much alimony he'd have to pay, and Delilah was planning which charities would photograph best at Celise's future wedding, Leora was literally negotiating a deal worth more than the entire Harland family fortune. She was going to be the lead strategist for a project that would build healthcare infrastructure across 43 countries. Her name would be on research papers, on international treaties, on hospital wings from Nairobi to Manila. But here's the thing that makes this even sweeter. She never told them, not once. Not when Delilah mocked her career ambitions over dinner. Not when Riven suggested she drop out and focus on being a proper wife. Not when they made her feel small and stupid and worthless. She just smiled and went back to her late-night calls with Geneva, back to her spreadsheets and strategic plans and world-changing negotiations, because Leora understood something they never would. The best power is the power people don't know you have. Every time they thought they were isolating her, they were actually giving her exactly what she needed. Time alone, space to work, freedom from their suffocating expectations. While they celebrated their little victories, deleting an email here, hiding a bill there, she was building something they couldn't touch, something they couldn't sabotage because they didn't even know it existed. And by the time they found out, it would be far too late to do anything but watch. The final contract was scheduled to be signed 1 week after graduation. Dr. Chen had already arranged everything: the press conference, the announcement, the global media coverage. Leora would walk across that stage, collect her degree, and step directly into a position of influence that would make the Harland family look like small-town amateurs playing at power. She'd have resources, authority, a platform that reached millions, and they would have nothing but their cruelty and their champagne, and their hollow victory that was about to turn into the most public humiliation of their lives. So when Delilah whispered to Riven that it was time to call Leora and tell her it was done, when they started planning graduation day like it was an execution, they had no idea they were actually planning their own downfall. They thought they were destroying a desperate, dependent woman with nowhere to go. What they were actually doing was giving her the perfect stage for the most spectacular reveal of her life. Comment iconic if you love, when the underestimated one has a secret weapon, because what's about to happen at that graduation ceremony will redefine what revenge looks like. Leora woke up that morning knowing exactly what was coming. Not the details, but the intention. She'd learned to read the Harland family like a language over 2 years of marriage. The sudden silence from Riven, the way Delira's texts had stopped entirely, the fact that Talise had posted a cryptic Instagram story the night before with a white dress and a caption that said, "Some days change everything." She knew they were planning something, and she knew it would be designed to break her on what should have been her proudest day. But what they didn't know was that Leora had spent the last 72 hours in final negotiations with Geneva. The contract was done. The press release was written. Dr. Chen had confirmed everything the night before in a call that lasted 90 minutes. All that remained was one final video conference at 9:45 that morning, 30 minutes before the graduation ceremony began. It was a formality, really, a chance for the consortium board to officially welcome her and discuss the announcement strategy. Leora had laid out her cap and gown at 6 in the morning and sat with her coffee, watching the sun rise over campus, knowing that in 4 hours, her entire life would be completely different. The text came at 9:15. Riven, first message in 6 days. Come to side entrance, important, before ceremony. That was it. No explanation, no context, just a command delivered like she was still someone who answered to him. Leora stared at that message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. She had 30 minutes until the biggest call of her life. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let them derail this moment. But she also knew that if she didn't show up, they'd find another way. Better to face it now on her terms than let them control the timing. She put on her dress. Simple, elegant, navy blue. Nothing that would photograph well for whatever spectacle they had planned. She fastened her cap and gown, checked her phone one more time to confirm the video call link was ready, and walked out the door. She had 22 minutes. If this was going to be the end of her marriage, it was going to happen quickly. The courtyard at the side entrance was where maintenance vehicles usually parked, secluded enough for privacy, but visible enough from certain windows if you wanted witnesses. Leora saw them before they saw her. Riven standing with his arms crossed, wearing a suit like he was attending a business meeting. Delira beside him with that expression of controlled satisfaction she always wore when she thought she was winning. And Celise, standing slightly apart in a white dress that looked bridal, holding a phone pointed directly at the entrance where Leora would appear. They were recording this. Of course they were recording this. This wasn't just about ending the marriage, this was about documentation, evidence, a public record they could control and distribute. Leora felt her phone buzz in her pocket as she walked toward them. 9:38, 7 minutes until her call. She kept walking. Riven didn't waste time on pleasantries. He pulled the papers from his jacket pocket like he'd been rehearsing the movement. Divorce papers, already signed on his end, witnessed and notarized. He held them out to her without meeting her eyes. Sign these. It's over. I've already moved your things out of the house. You have until Monday to arrange permanent housing. His voice was flat, mechanical, like he was reading from a script Delira had written. Leora took the papers. She looked at them, at the signatures, at the legal language that reduced 2 years of her life to clauses about asset division and termination of spousal rights. She looked up at Celise, still recording, that little smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She looked at Delira, who was watching like a director observing her finest scene. And she felt her phone buzz again in her pocket. 9:41, 4 minutes. Have you ever stood in front of people who turned your pain into entertainment? That's the question Leora wanted to ask them in that moment. Have you ever been so thoroughly reduced to a plot point in someone else's story that they forgot you were actually human? That you had feelings and dreams and a future they knew nothing about? But she didn't ask. She didn't need to. Because in 4 minutes none of this would matter anymore. She folded the papers without signing them and put them in her bag. I'll have my lawyer look at these, she said simply. Riven's jaw tightened. That wasn't the script. She was supposed to cry, to beg, to make a scene that would look dramatic on camera. Delira stepped forward, her voice sharp. There's nothing to look at. Sign them now or we make this much more difficult for you. Leora's phone buzzed a third time. 9:43. 2 minutes. She looked at all three of them, memorizing this moment, knowing that in 72 hours when the press announcement went global, she'd remember exactly how they looked right now. Confident, cruel, utterly certain of their power over her. "I have somewhere I need to be," she said, and turned to walk away. She made it 5 steps before Delira's voice cut across the courtyard. "You walk away now and you'll have nothing. No family, no support, no future." Leora stopped, turned back, and for the first time in 2 years, she let them see exactly what she thought of them. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'll have no family, but I'll have everything else." And then she walked away, while Celis was still recording, and Riven was still holding the unsigned papers, and Delira was processing the fact that her perfectly planned humiliation had just failed to land. Leora made it to a private hallway in the administration building with 90 seconds to spare. She opened her laptop, clicked the video conference link, and watched her screen fill with faces from Geneva. Dr. Chen smiled at her. "Leora, are you ready to change the world?" Behind Dr. Chen, she could see the consortium board, 12 people representing billions in resources and global influence. They were all looking at her, waiting for her. "I'm ready," Leora said, and meant it with every cell in her body. The call lasted exactly 7 minutes. Confirmations, congratulations, details about the press conference that would happen in 90 minutes, broadcast live during the graduation ceremony. Dr. Chen explained that they'd coordinated with the university, that Leora's name would be called, that when she walked across that stage, the world would know exactly who she was and what she'd accomplished. "This is your moment," Dr. Chen said. "Everything you've worked for, enjoy it." Leora closed her laptop at 9:54. The ceremony was beginning. She could hear the music starting, the rustle of hundreds of graduates lining up in alphabetical order. She made her way to her place in line, surrounded by classmates she barely knew, people who had no idea what was about to happen. Somewhere in the audience, the Harland family was sitting in their reserved seats, front row. They'd arrived early to make sure they had the best view. They wanted to watch her walk across that stage alone, humiliated, freshly divorced, with nowhere to go and no one to celebrate with. What they didn't know was that in 60 seconds, the screens in that auditorium would flicker to life with a live feed from Geneva. That Leora's name would appear with a title that would make their blood run cold. That the next $800 million of global healthcare funding would have her signature on every contract. They had front row seats, all right, to the complete destruction of every assumption they'd ever made about who she was and what she was capable of becoming. The music swelled, the ceremony began, and Leora took her first step toward a future they couldn't even imagine. The ceremony had reached that comfortable rhythm that all graduations fall into. Names being called in alphabetical order, the polite applause, the occasional whoop from a proud family member in the crowd. The dean was working through the H's now, getting closer to Harland with every name. Leora stood in line, hands folded, breathing steady, watching the large screens on either side of the stage that displayed each graduate's name and photo as they walked across. She could see the Harland family in the third row. Riven staring at his phone. Delira whispering something to the woman beside her. Celis taking selfies, probably already drafting the social media post about how she'd attended Riven's ex-wife's graduation out of the goodness of her heart. Then the screen flickered. Just for a second, a glitch that made a few people in the audience look up. The dean paused, glancing back at the technical booth with mild confusion. And then the screen changed completely. No more graduate photos. Instead, a live feed from what was clearly an international press conference. The Global Health Consortium logo, a podium with multiple microphones, and Dr. Amara Chen looking directly into the camera with the kind of authority that makes rooms go silent. The murmur started immediately, confused whispers rippling through the auditorium. The dean stopped reading names entirely, turning to look at the screen. Dr. Chen's voice came through the sound system, clear and commanding. "Thank you for joining us for this historic announcement. Today, the Global Health Consortium is proud to unveil the largest coordinated healthcare initiative in our organization's history. An $800 million commitment to transforming healthcare access across 43 nations. $800 million. The number appeared on screen in stark white text against a blue background, and the auditorium gasped. You could feel the energy shift, everyone leaning forward, trying to understand what this had to do with a graduation ceremony. Dr. Chen continued, her voice filling every corner of the room. This initiative represents years of research, strategic planning, and visionary thinking. It will establish sustainable healthcare infrastructure in communities that have been systematically underserved. It will save lives, millions of lives, and it exists because of one person's refusal to accept the world as it is. The screen split then. Dr. Chen on one side and on the other, a professional photo that Leora barely recognized as herself. Her name appeared below it in text that seemed to glow. Leora Harland, Lead Strategist, Global Healthcare Integration Initiative. The auditorium erupted, not polite applause anymore, but actual shock. People standing to see better, pointing at the screen, then turning to find Leora in the line of graduates. The dean's mouth had fallen open, and in the third row, you could watch in real time as the Harland family processed what they were seeing. Delira's face went through 3 distinct expressions in 5 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like physical pain. Riven had dropped his phone. Just let it fall right out of his hand onto the auditorium floor, staring at the screen like it was showing him footage of his own funeral. And Celise had stopped smiling entirely, that white dress suddenly looking less like a victory costume and more like a surrender flag. Watch their faces. This is the moment they realized they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. Dr. Chen was still speaking, explaining the scope of the project, the countries involved, the anticipated impact. But Leora wasn't listening anymore. The dean had found her in the line, was gesturing for her to come forward now, out of alphabetical order, because apparently the entire ceremony had just become about her. She walked up those steps to the stage, with her head high and her hands steady. And the applause that met her wasn't polite graduation applause. It was thunder. It was 1,000 people who just watched someone's hidden greatness get revealed in the most spectacular way possible. The dean handed her the diploma with shaking hands, clearly improvising now, and then stepped aside to give Leora the podium. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the crowd, at her classmates who were cheering like she'd just won a championship, at the faculty who were on their feet applauding, and then she looked directly at the third row, at the 3 people who'd spent months trying to make her feel worthless. She reached into her bag and pulled out the divorce papers Riven had given her 90 minutes ago. "I want to thank everyone who believed in me," Leora said, her voice carrying across the auditorium without a tremor. "And I want to thank everyone who didn't, because you taught me something invaluable. You taught me that other people's limitations are not my own, that someone else's inability to see my worth doesn't diminish it, that the best response to cruelty isn't cruelty in return." She held up the divorce papers, and the room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. "I don't need revenge. My success is revenge." She tore the papers in half, then in half again, and again. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the sound system, and pieces began falling like confetti around her feet. The auditorium lost its mind. The standing ovation was instant and deafening. Her classmates were chanting her name now. "Leora! Leora! Leora!" The rhythmic sound of 1,000 voices turning her name into a victory anthem. She stood there in that moment, letting it wash over her, letting herself finally feel everything she'd been holding back for 2 years. Dr. Chen's voice came through the speakers again, cutting through the applause. "Leora, we need you in Geneva by Monday. Your office is ready, your team is assembled, and the world is waiting to see what you'll do next." Then Dr. Chen stated the number that made even the chanters pause. "Your annual compensation is $12 million, with performance bonuses that could double that. But I don't think you're doing this for the money. I think you're doing this because you can't imagine doing anything else. $12 million annually." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Leora watched Celise stand up and slip out of her row, moving toward the exit with her head down, that white dress now looking absurd and desperate. She watched Riven put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking, whether from anger or despair she couldn't tell and didn't care. And she watched Delilah, the architect of so much calculated cruelty, sitting frozen in her seat, staring at nothing, her face completely blank with the kind of defeat that comes from realizing you've destroyed yourself. They came to bury her. They came with cameras and divorce papers and a replacement already chosen. They came to watch her break, to see her humiliated, to witness her lowest moment and ensure everyone else witnessed it too. Instead, they got front-row seats to the complete dismantling of every lie they'd told themselves about who she was. They watched her become everything they'd feared she might be and everything they'd tried to prevent her from becoming. They watched her transform from the woman they'd tried to break into someone so far beyond their reach that they'd spend years trying to explain how they'd missed it. Leora stepped down from that podium and walked back to her place in line, diploma in hand, pieces of torn divorce papers left scattered on the stage behind her. The ceremony continued, but nobody was really paying attention anymore. The story had already been told. The victory had already been won. And somewhere in Geneva, an office with her name on the door was waiting for someone who'd learned that the best revenge isn't hurting the people who hurt you. It's becoming so successful that their cruelty becomes irrelevant. It's building a life so extraordinary that their opinions of you become background noise you don't even hear anymore. It's walking away from their poison and into a future they couldn't destroy, even if you gave them 1,000 more chances to try. The ceremony ended the way all ceremonies end, with the traditional tossing of caps, with families flooding toward the stage, with that chaotic joy of people trying to find their graduate in a sea of identical gowns. But Leora didn't wait for anyone. She slipped away while the crowd was still celebrating, walking back through the administration building and out toward the main campus gates. No family waiting to take photos, no friends planning celebration dinners. Just her alone with a diploma in her bag and a future in Geneva that felt more real than anything that had happened in the last 2 years. Her phone buzzed as she reached the edge of campus. Flight details. First class to Geneva, departing Sunday evening. A car would pick her up at noon to take her to her new temporary housing while she searched for something permanent. The consortium had arranged everything. There was an orientation schedule, a list of her new team members, and a preliminary meeting agenda for her first week. 12 meetings in 5 days with ministers of health, NGO directors, and infrastructure specialists. Her life for the next decade, maybe longer, laid out in careful detail. Leora stopped walking and stood there on the pathway where she'd walked 1,000 times as a student, where she'd hurried between classes while Delira's texts buzzed with criticism, where she'd taken calls from Dr. Chen while pretending to Riven that she was just studying. This campus had been her refuge and her prison, the place where she'd rebuilt herself while everyone around her tried to tear her down. And now she was leaving it behind, not as someone running away, but as someone who had outgrown the space entirely. She thought about texting Riven, something final and cutting, a last word that would make sure he understood exactly what he'd lost. But what would be the point? He already knew. Everyone knew now. The video of her announcement would be on every social media platform by tonight. The footage of her tearing up those divorce papers would become one of those viral moments that people share with captions about resilience and triumph. Her story would be told and retold, dissected and analyzed, turned into motivation for other women in similar situations. She didn't need to add anything to it. The truth was simpler and more powerful than any parting shot she could deliver. She had won, not by destroying them, though watching their faces in that auditorium had certainly been satisfying, not by exposing them, though their cruelty had exposed itself quite effectively. She had won by refusing to let their version of her become the truth, by working in silence while they celebrated her anticipated failure, by building something so substantial that their attempts to diminish her looked pathetic in comparison. Freedom once tasted can never be taken away. That's what Leora understood now, standing at the edge of her old life and looking toward her new one. The Harland family could never touch her again because she'd stopped giving them permission to define her worth. Delilah could scheme and manipulate all she wanted, but in Geneva her opinions would matter as much as a stranger's on the street. Riven could find a dozen replacements, and none of it would affect the work Leora was about to do, or the impact she was about to make. They had tried to trap her in a life that made them comfortable, and instead, they had accidentally trained her to thrive in discomfort, to work in isolation, to succeed despite opposition. She started walking again away from campus, toward the apartment where she'd packed the last of her belongings that morning. She'd lived there alone for the past 4 months after Delilah had made the mansion unbearable, in a tiny studio that cost too much and had unreliable heating. She wouldn't miss it. She wouldn't miss this city or this life or the person she'd had to be to survive it. In 48 hours, she'd be on a plane. In a week, she'd be in meetings that would affect millions of lives. In a year, she'd have results to show, infrastructure built, systems implemented, proof that her vision wasn't just theoretical but transformative. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming untouchable. Not above criticism or beyond failure, but untouchable in the sense that other people's cruelty can't reach you anymore. Their words bounce off the armor of your accomplishments. Their schemes fall apart against the foundation of your success. Their attempts to diminish you reveal more about their insecurity than your worth. Leora had spent 2 years being touchable, vulnerable, exposed to every cut and manipulation the Harland family could devise. Now she was stepping into a life where their reach simply didn't extend. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Dr. Chen. "How does it feel?" Leora smiled and typed back 3 words. "Like coming home." Because that's what this was ultimately. Not revenge, though it certainly looked like it from the outside. Not victory, though she'd undeniably won. It was homecoming. A return to who she'd always been before she'd let someone else's family convince her she needed to be smaller, quieter, less ambitious. A return to the version of herself that believed she could change the world, and then went out and actually did it. If you're watching this and you've ever been in Leora's position, if you've ever been told you're too much or not enough, if you've ever been sabotaged by people who were supposed to support you, remember this. They can delete your emails, but they can't delete your potential. They can hide your opportunities, but they can't hide your talent. They can try to break you, but they can't stop you from rebuilding yourself stronger. Your success doesn't require their permission. Your worth doesn't depend on their validation. And your future doesn't have to include anyone who tried to steal your past. Leora Harland walked away from that campus with nothing but a diploma and a plane ticket. But she was walking toward $800 million of world-changing work, toward a team that valued her mind, toward a life that would never again require her to make herself small for someone else's comfort. She was walking toward freedom. And once you've tasted that, once you've felt what it's like to be completely untouchable, you can never go back to being someone's convenient target. The cage door was open, and she was never coming back.